who is the Senior Preparedness Analyst at the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement Oil Spill Preparedness Division, Gulf of Mexico Preparedness Section in New Orleans, Louisiana, and he is one of the 8 preparedness analysis in the division office in New Orleans, Louisiana. And the division is responsible for offshore oil and gas spill planning and preparedness regulatory compliance with the oil spill response requirements for facilities located seaward of the coastline. And he's been with Besti since 2012, correct?
Yes.
Without further ado, Jerry Petrae.
Well, good morning and Happy New Year. And Monica pretty much described who I am and where I came from. So, and Mike Sams did a great job of describing the overall framework under which we and other federal agencies operate with regards to planning, preparedness, and response to spills. Our piece of it is exclusively focused on seaward of the coastline. So I'm going to dive into that. Even Mike Drew touched on some of our responsibilities with regards to his description of the Nexus exercise, the PrEP exercise. And you'll see me touch on those points also. So I'll first describe, I can't be up here as a government representative without talking about the Bureau itself and how we fit in and who we are. So, but there's another reason for that, and that is that even though we've been around for 6+ years, there are still some people that think that we may not be what MMS used to be. So originally, when the oil exploration and production activities moved offshore, I guess I need to stay close to the mic, don't I? When the oil exploration and production activities moved offshore, the responsibilities for oversight of those activities fell to the Department of Interior, like they did on land, but primarily with the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Geological Survey. But eventually, it's probably been 30-something years ago, they created the Minerals Management Service. So until 2010, all of the stuff that I'll be talking about was the responsibility of the Minerals Management Service. In 2010, they created what I like to refer to as a holding bureau while they reorganized. And ultimately, in 2011, they created the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, and I'm going to call it Besti. So as a government employee, I'm going to be using acronyms and initialisms. If I lose anybody, call me on it, please. But our sister agency, one of them, the biggest of the other 2, is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And I'm fortunate that 2 of our representatives from BOEM, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, are here today. So if you're going to ask me any questions about the leasing activities, the environmental impact statements, the National Environmental Policy Act responsibilities, environmental compliance responsibilities that are placed on the leases, I am fortunate to have them here, and I'm going to deflect every question to them. So I think I warned them about that before we started. And then there was another piece of MMS which I just mentioned, and that was the piece that collected the royalties. So because of those resources offshore are the property of the citizens of the United States, the government collects royalties on their use or extraction. And so that component, the Office of National Resource Royalties, was also split off. So essentially MMS became 3 different components in the Department of Interior now. So we're in the Gulf of Mexico, so I obviously will be focusing on the Gulf of Mexico region. Our division, the Oil Spill Preparedness Division, is actually, though, a headquarters unit. Even though we're co-located here in New Orleans, my boss's boss is in Sterling, Virginia, outside of D.C. So essentially, our responsibilities in our division is a headquarters unit, even though we're here and co-located in the Gulf of Mexico region's building. Talk about preparedness compliance, get into response plans, and then dive into how we try to ensure preparedness in addition to the plans through audits and inspections and evaluations of exercises and such. And then eventually I am going to get to the response research piece. That's a branch within our division, again at headquarters, and over the past several years, particularly since 2010, tens of millions of dollars have been diverted or focused on oil spill response research. And so there'll be quite a bit of information, particularly after my presentation. There's, over a dozen slides specific to some of our research projects that I'm not going to speak to, but I did include them in the presentation for those who have access to it after the seminar. So this is Besti. This is how the organization is described. You've got to have an org chart. So this is how we fit in. Most of the components of that are either in headquarters in Sterling, or downtown in DC, or in the Gulf of Mexico region in New Orleans, the Alaska region in Anchorage, or the Pacific region in Camarillo, California. I would also be remiss if I didn't include the authorities under which we operate. Mike Sands did an excellent job of laying out that national response system, the framework under which we operate. We could not function in our planning and preparedness and response responsibilities without the National Contingency Plan, the area contingency plans, and under that national response system. So that's how we fit in. But I did want to include a slide that includes some of the authorities under which we operate. And because I'm going to spend most of the time talking about the Oil Spill Preparedness Division, I do want to at least mention at this point that the other activities in Besti that come into play with regards to prevention in particular and response technically fall under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act more than it does under the planning responsibilities under the Oil Spill Response Plan regulations. So the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act is pretty much the way the components of Besti operate separate from our division. So all of the offshore oil and gas activities that take place are overseen by Besti, and I'll get into more detail, so I won't spend much time on it here. But all of those regulations fall under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. Our specific regulations in our division, the Oil Spill Preparedness Division, come from Open 90, which amended the Clean Water Act, and are found in 30 CFR 254. And since one of the things we're supposed to touch on is what's happened since Macondo's blowout, since the Deepwater Horizon incident. And those can best be described by what are abbreviated up there as NTLs. So Besti and, does BOEM put out NTLs? Yeah. So Besti and BOEM both put out notice to leasees, which is guidance to further elaborate on what's expected for your environmental compliance. So in particular, since Deepwater Horizon, Besti's issued 2 national notice to lessees. One in 2012 with regards to the plans themselves, and another one in 2013 with regards to worst case discharges that we expect to see described in our plans. One I was remiss in not including up there was an NTL that was issued very soon after the incident in 2010 that eventually became the well control rule, which is technically now part of 30 CFR 250. And recently it was in the news because it's the rule that was mentioned recently that's being re-looked at with regards to the requirements for offshore operators with their abilities to control a well blowout. So these are the locations of the Besti offices that I mentioned previously. And so I do want to touch on our colleagues in the regional office. And as I pointed out, much of their activity on a daily basis falls under the prevention category. So as they're overseeing everything that happens from once the lease is issued by BOEM to the operator, they start the process of applying for permission in the way of permits to go offshore and start exploration and eventually, if they're lucky, production. So I'm not going to read through every bullet up there. I might highlight a couple of points. But essentially, as those activities are taking place, Besti's regional office staff and then the district staff, particularly the district staff, literally are doing offshore inspections. They're reviewing plans, they're reviewing permit applications, they're reviewing applications for modifications to permits. And then there's also a component of the regional office as well as a national program for environmental compliance. And so that's the piece where Besti also makes sure that all of the environmental compliance requirements that were placed on the operators during the leasing process and then subsequently during the permit approval process are complied with. So, and then ultimately, it'll come up later, but ultimately, if there's an incident, because Besti's involved in those offshore activities on a daily basis, everything that takes place, they would be involved in the response because in every case, there has to be activities that fall under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act that ultimately secure the discharge and respond to the spill. This was just some background information. So this is as of December. It's currently the drilling rigs that are active in the Gulf, and I just added this information for informational purposes. This slide didn't get updated. It's a little dated. It's a year old. That's essentially a summary of all the production facilities that are currently active in the Gulf. Okay, so back to our division. So our division's separated. I mentioned the response research branch, headquarters unit. We're in the preparedness verification branch, and I have colleagues in Alaska and California, and then, as was mentioned in my introduction, there's 8 of me, and then 2 other additional staff here in New Orleans in our section. I'm going to touch on response first, because it's the closest link back to the National Response System and the NCPs. So in an incident, should an incident occur, Besti would get involved in the response, as I mentioned previously, basically overseeing all those activities that take place on a daily basis, because everything that the operator would have to do to secure the source, for instance, would have to fall under those regulations. So you'll see when I describe Besti's role in response, it's mostly going to be in the source control arena. And I know that the source control item dropped off the agenda, and Mike didn't mention it, but Mike has some information that we could
change the
stick
agenda.
back in at the end.
We're going to change the agenda.
So we can speak to some source control issues with regards to securing a source at the end of the day, because there's certainly plenty of people here who can speak to the issue, and then Mike's actually got some visual materials that we can use to speak to. But so essentially, and in some ways, even BOEM would get involved in an incident like this, in a big discharge in particular, because in a response, some of the issues that you have to deal with relate back to the same issues that Besti and BOEM too, for that matter, are dealing with on a daily basis. And as I said, source control is a great example of that. And so because source control is a great example of that, I wanted to add this chart. So I don't think we've avoided the issue of boring you with too many org charts, but this one's important in that it describes what is basically an incident response organization. You have a unified command at the top. You're going to have command and general staff, and I'm throwing out terms here that may be unfamiliar to some of you, but just bear with me. So you have an organization that's comprised of these components. But Besti fits in as a source control support coordinator and in the source control branch. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on my 20 minutes on this issue, but yeah, especially if I look at the time. So hopefully we'll get into that later. And so Mike Sams also touched on this, the vessel and facility response plans when he talked about the planning and preparedness activities in the United States. And so he mentioned the facility plans. So essentially what happened after OPA was that the responsibility for offshore facility plans fell to Besti. And so that was delegated, well, to MMS actually, and then it became Besti. The plans, so our preparedness responsibilities primarily relate specifically to the oil spill response plans. So our planning and preparedness activities are tied to an oil spill response plan. But in association with that, we conduct other preparedness activities related to the operators and their contractors' preparedness to respond to an incident should one occur. The plans themselves, again, I thank Mike again for mentioning the National Contingency Plan and the Area Contingency Plans, because one of the important aspects of our regulations is that all of the oil spill response plans offshore have to be consistent with the area contingency plans. And that, in fact, that assurance is carried out through cooperation between our section and our division, for that matter, and the Coast Guard units. And in the Gulf, in particular, it's our section and in Mike's office in District 8. So I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but it describes the beginning and end of an oil spill response plan. The key takeaway from this is once an initial plan is submitted and we review it and it's approved, that plan will remain approved until it's rescinded and our approval is rescinded. In between those two endpoints, beginning and end point, lots of things are going to happen. At the very least, we're going to see that plan every 2 years. They're required to review their plan every 2 years and submit modifications if necessary. And if not, tell us that there aren't any modifications. That is almost impossible because during a 2-year period, there are certain things that have to happen in your plan. Now, other than those 2-year reviews, there are 4 things that they are required to submit revisions for. I'm not going to go into those in detail, but one, for instance, that's important is if something changes with their scenarios that are described in their plan. And the best example is a volume, a calculated volume on what the worst case discharge might be increases. If it increases significantly enough, they have to send in a revision and we have to approve it. Other modifications that might be submitted, like changes in personnel, updates on their training, we make sure that those plans are still in compliance. But it's these major changes that would actually require an approval. I wanted to include this slide just to show you the contents of an OSRP. And probably, and even though I'm starting to run out of time, because it ties back to some of the changes since Deepwater Horizon, over time, the OSRPs had evolved. And so what's mostly happened since Deepwater Horizon was that NTL that we published in 2012 captured all of those things that had taken place during that evolution of plans. But it also captured all the lessons learned from all of the studies, particularly the Department of Interior study post-Macondo, and the broader government-wide studies that took place post-Macondo. So when we issued that 2012 NTL, it provided us with the opportunity to send out guidance as to what our expectations would be for what an OSRP should look like. These plans are usually well over 400 pages long. So I was able to cram all this on one slide, but if you had a plan, it would be at least 400 pages long. But that NTL helped us to steer people in the direction of the lessons learned from Macondo, as well as the other lessons that we had learned prior to that. And the following slides are basically just some examples of the other preparedness activities we do. So all of the equipment that's required to respond to an incident, has to be described in the plan. But of course, describing it in a plan doesn't mean that it's prepared to respond. So those organizations, those entities that are responsible for that equipment undertake significant effort to make sure that that's the case, that all that equipment is prepared for a response. We monitor those activities, and then we actually go out and we conduct inspections to assure that that's the case. And we used to do about 35 to 40 of those a year, and actually I think now we're doing probably another 20 or 30 each year in different locations. So the equipment's staged around the Gulf, so we go to the different depots and install the equipment. We conduct unannounced exercises. So Mike described in a very good way the Mexis exercise. So that one that was held in March in Schriever was their annual S&T exercise that our regulations require. Thanks. But in addition to that, we will conduct an unannounced exercise on the operators where they're expected to carry out a response, a simulated response, with no notice. So we essentially will call up the qualified individuals specified in the plan and tell them it's your turn to play, you've been chosen, and then we initiate an unannounced exercise with a scripted scenario that we've created. And as I said, they're required to do annual SMT exercises. They're also required to deploy the equipment once a year. So it turns out we don't make them deploy every piece of equipment, but at the very least, they have to deploy at least one of each type every year. So there's deployment exercises, and usually associated with those exercises is training. So we audit those activities. So we actually go out and observe the training and the deployment of that response equipment. And one of the other there is a notification exercise, so they have to annually go through their notification chain. And then I wanted to mention this. So during our unannounced exercise programs, we make sure that there's at least 2 exercises a year, and we do many. We've done as many as 18 to 24 unannounced exercises in a given year. We make sure that at least 2 include a source control component. But in addition to that, I stuck this slide up there with these pictures. In 2012 and in 2013, the Department of Interior and Besti required that the capping stacks that are available for a blowout response from the Marine Well Containment Company and HWCG, we required that equipment actually be taken offshore and deployed and tested. Shell was the chosen party in 2012, and Noble Energy was the chosen party in 2013. Now the research, if I have time.
A minute.
Yeah, okay. I won't speak to each one of these slides, but essentially, MMS's and now Besti's oil spill response research program has existed for years. So what's basically happened since Macondo has been focus on some of the issues that came up during that response. And coincidentally, there was a focus on the Arctic, because at the same time, if you remember, there was the interest in opening up the Arctic for response. I mean, for exploration and production, and in the way of Shell. Shell was, had a project that they were going to initiate. So since then, the tens of millions of dollars have been spent on oil spill response research, and I just wanted to touch on a few of the projects. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that part of the research branch's responsibility is to operate OMSET, the National Oil Spill Response Research and Renewable Energy Test Facility, which you could call OMSET, and for those of us who've been around for a while, we know what that acronym actually stands for, because it's probably a 35, 40-year-old facility that at one point actually almost went inactive. It was restored, brought back, and MMS was given responsibility for operating it. So it's this large test tank you see. It's in New Jersey. And literally, you can see the size of that skimmer that's in the tank. So that's where they test a lot of this equipment. One of our research projects was calculators for planning to help you assess the capability you may have with your mechanical recovery equipment, the ability to use dispersants and how they may be applied to a response, and how they might help with the response, as well as in situ burning. And then the last piece is that there's a little tool that you can use for sensitivity analysis with regards to the mechanical recovery calculator. To support a reg rewrite effort, our regulations were published in 1997. They're due for a rewrite. To support that, we conducted a capability study, and I refer you to our website for that. And Monica's getting ready to kick me off the stage. So I've included some slides on these selected projects. I won't spend any more time on them. I'll ask you to, and the slides are pretty informative, so please refer to the slides. And then, as I said, at the end, there's a whole slew of additional projects that I've included in the presentation. And those slides are equally informative as to these projects that are currently on. These are all currently ongoing too, by the way. And then to be fair, if you go to Besti's website, you can find all this information with regards to those projects.